Welcome to Timeless Love Stories. Tonight's story is an original romantic tale set in the Victorian age. If you enjoy slow-burn romance, deep emotion, and love stories shaped by history, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let us begin. The rain had been falling since before dawn, and in Manchester it never felt like weather alone, because it seemed to rise as much from the streets as it descended from the sky, turning soot into paste, stone into shadow, and every breath into something damp and heavy, as though the city insisted on being tasted. Smoke lingered low between the chimneys and the narrow lanes, and the air carried the familiar mixture of coal, wet brick, and the sharp, metallic scent that came from machines working too long without rest, while carts rattled over uneven cobbles and men in caps and women in shawls moved with their shoulders slightly hunched, not only from cold but from habit. Mary walked with her head bowed, her shawl pulled tight across her chest, because the wind found every gap in wool and every weakness in seams, and because a young woman alone in a working street learned, early and without instruction, that the less she invited attention the more safely she would arrive wherever she meant to go. Her boots were thin, her stockings patched, and her hands ached with that familiar stiffness that followed hours of labor in damp conditions, but she did not hurry, not because she had nowhere to be, although that was true in a way she was not ready to name, but because she had learned that panic wasted energy, and energy was a currency she could not afford to spend carelessly. At 24, Mary had the look of someone who had stopped waiting for luck, and yet had not fully stopped believing in small mercies. Her face was plain in the way that hard lives often made faces plain, not because beauty vanished, but because beauty grew quiet when it had no time to perform, and her eyes carried a steadiness that came from enduring difficulty until it became routine. She had been an orphan since her adolescence, not in the sentimental way stories sometimes described, with one dramatic moment and then sudden rescue, but in the slow, unremarkable way the poor disappeared from one another's lives, as if the world simply swallowed them when it was done with them, leaving behind an emptiness that could not be mourned properly because there was always work, always rent, always the next meal to secure. She remembered her mother's hands more clearly than her face, remembered the warmth of a palm on her forehead when fever came, remembered the smell of soap that never lasted because it could not outlast hunger and smoke. She remembered her father's voice at the end, a rasping sound that tried to be reassuring, and she remembered the day she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than grief, that no one would come and make things easier simply because she deserved it. From that day onward, she had worked in kitchens, in laundries, in small shops, and finally in the mill, where the noise was so constant it stopped being noise and became something like weather, a roaring mechanical sky under which you lived, shouted, and prayed silently that your fingers would remain attached to your hands. The mill had been cruel, but it had been dependable, and dependability was its own kind of shelter. The wages were small, the hours brutal, the air thick with lint and oil, yet a pay packet meant rent could be paid on time, and rent meant you did not have to beg, and begging meant the slow loss of the last thing you owned, which was your dignity. Mary did not romanticize work, but she respected it, and she respected herself for surviving it, which was perhaps why the dismissal that morning had landed in her chest like a stone rather than like a blade, because blades were dramatic and stones simply sat there, heavy and undeniable, changing the way you stood and breathed and moved. It had happened without warning, in the middle of the day, when the machines were running and the foreman's voice was already hoarse from barking instructions over the din. A woman on Mary's line had cried out, not loudly at first, but with a sound that cut strangely through the machinery because it was human, because it carried fear and pain together. She had doubled over, her hands instinctively reaching for her belly, and then, in a moment that should have invited compassion, the world around her had frozen in bewilderment and irritation, as though the greatest offense was not suffering but interruption. Later, after the woman had been carried away and the floor scrubbed as if to erase the evidence of weakness, the owner had come down himself, a stout man with a starched collar and a face that reddened easily with indignation, and he had spoken about propriety and discipline and the shame of it, calling the incident an outrage, as though childbirth were a deliberate act of sabotage, and then he had announced, in a voice sharpened by old-fashioned certainty, that women could not be trusted with serious work, that their bodies made them unreliable, and that he would not have the reputation of his factory stained by such disgrace again. All the women were to be dismissed, he said, and the men could do the work instead, even if it cost more, because principle mattered more than practicality when principle protected a man's authority. Mary had not pleaded, because she had learned that pleading made men feel powerful, and powerful men rarely became merciful. She had watched other women argue, watched their faces flush and their voices crack, watched them point out that they had families to feed and rent due and no husbands to cover the loss, and she had seen the owner's expression harden as if their desperation were proof of their unfitness, and then, when the shouting finally dissolved into bitterness and stunned silence, she had collected her things quietly, a small bundle of personal items that made her seem smaller than she already felt, and she had walked out with the rest into the grey rain, into a city that did not pause to notice. Now, as she reached the narrow street where she rented a room, she felt the city's indifference more keenly, because when you are safe enough you can pretend the world is merely busy, but when you are threatened, you realize it has always been indifferent and you simply had not wanted to see it. The houses here were built back to back, pressed together in rows like teeth, each one a small compartment of life where families squeezed themselves into 2 rooms and tried to live as if space were not a luxury. Laundry lines crisscrossed between windows, and the smell of boiling cabbage and cheap soap drifted outward when doors opened. Mary climbed the stairs to the landing that served as corridor, her steps quiet on the worn boards, and she found the landlady waiting as though she had been expecting the news to arrive on Mary's face. The older woman's hands were tucked under her apron, her mouth set in a line that might have been sympathy in another life, but here it was calculation, because sympathy did not pay rent. "You'll need to settle by the end of the week," the landlady said, her voice not unkind but unmoved. "Or make other arrangements." Mary nodded, because arguing would not create money, and because she had no strength to waste on anger that would change nothing. "I lost the work," she said anyway, not as a plea, but as a statement, as if naming it might make it less shapeless. The landlady replied, and her eyes flicked downward, noticing Mary's damp hem, Mary's thin boots, the smallness of the bundle she carried. "It's hard times, love. Hard for all. I can't keep rooms on air." Mary nodded again, because it was true, and truth could be cruel without being personal. Inside her room, the air smelled of damp and old fabric, the window was small, the light grey, and the single bed looked suddenly less like shelter and more like something temporary, a waiting place. She sat on the edge of the mattress and folded her hands together, pressing her fingertips so firmly they ached, because physical sensation kept panic at bay, and she breathed carefully, counting the breaths without meaning to, an old habit from nights when hunger made sleep difficult and you had to control your mind so it did not run wild. She did not cry, because crying required the belief that someone might respond to tears, and Mary had stopped believing that when she was 15. Instead, she began to think in lists, because lists were practical: how much she had saved, how many days the money could stretch, who might hire her, which neighbors might know of work, whether the workhouse could be avoided, and for how long. She imagined the workhouse as she had seen it once, a building that promised shelter and delivered humiliation, and she felt something tighten in her throat, not fear exactly, but a kind of refusal that was almost pride, because she could bear hardship, but she had never stopped wanting to bear it on her own terms. It was late afternoon when she returned to the mill to collect what she had left behind: a tin cup, a scarf, a pair of gloves too thin to matter, but hers nonetheless, and the factory yard looked different without the usual flood of workers spilling in and out. The gate stood open, the rain had eased into a mist, and the building loomed like a dark block against the low sky, its windows dull with grime. Inside, the machines were quieter than usual, some already stopped, and the men who remained moved with that wary alertness that followed conflict, as though they expected another announcement, another cruelty disguised as discipline. Mary kept her eyes down and walked with purpose, and it was then that she noticed him, standing near the largest frames where the belts ran and the wheels turned, a man with his sleeves rolled up and grease on his hands, bent over a mechanism as if in conversation with it, his posture relaxed but attentive, his mind clearly working several steps ahead of whatever problem he was solving. James. She had seen him before, of course, but only in passing, because the factory kept workers divided in quiet ways, and Mary did not usually allow herself to look too long at anyone with authority, even authority earned rather than inherited. James was 29, or thereabouts, with the build of someone who worked with both hands and mind, not broad like a brawler, but solid in a way that suggested endurance. His hair was dark, cut short, perpetually disordered, and his face carried a seriousness that did not read as severity so much as concentration, as though he had learned to hold his emotions in check because emotions were distractions when machines could injure you. He was the overseer of sorts, though not the kind who shouted for pleasure. He was responsible for keeping the machines running, for improving what could be improved with limited parts and limited goodwill, and there was talk, always talk, that he was more than a mechanic, that he understood principles and plans, and that he read pamphlets he should not read. Workers whispered that he attended meetings, that he spoke about unions and rights, that he believed men should not be ground down until they were nothing but hands, and that he had the dangerous habit of thinking the world could be changed. Mary did not know what to think of men like that, because men who wanted to change the world often forgot that women had to live in it while it changed, and yet she had seen him once, months earlier, when a boy's sleeve had caught in a belt, and James had moved with lightning speed to shut the machine down before flesh tore. He had not looked for praise afterward, and he had not scolded the boy in front of others, but had spoken to him quietly, as if saving a life did not require humiliation as payment. She gathered her things quickly, intending to leave without notice, but as she turned, she heard footsteps behind her, and then, to her surprise, she heard her own name spoken in a voice that did not carry command so much as cautious intent. Mary. She stopped and turned, eyes studying her as though he were trying to understand something that did not fit neatly into a machine's logic. Yes, she said, and she kept her voice even because she refused to sound vulnerable, even now. I heard what happened, he replied, as if there were only one thing in the entire factory worth naming. We all heard, Mary answered, because bitterness was easier than fear. James nodded slowly, and she saw a flicker of anger pass behind his eyes, not directed at her, but outward, toward an injustice he could not ignore. He did not speak immediately, and Mary wondered if he had approached only to offer sympathy, which would be useless, and then he asked, in a voice softened by sincerity, "Do you have somewhere to go?" The question landed in her chest, and Mary felt a brief urge to lie, because pride demanded it, but pride did not pay rent, and she had promised herself long ago that she would not choose pride over survival just to prove she could suffer beautifully. "I'll manage," she said anyway, because truth could be given in pieces. James did not challenge the answer, but he did not step away either, and Mary felt the faint tightening of caution, because whenever a man did not step away, he usually wanted something. "I have a proposal," he said, and the word made her shoulders tense before she could stop it. She waited, her gaze steady, her bundle held close, her body prepared to leave at the first sign of coercion. "I live alone," James continued, speaking carefully, as if he understood the danger of his own words. "In Ancoats, in a small back-to-back. The rent is paid, and it's dry. I'm not asking charity of you, and I'm not offering charity either. I need help keeping the house, and I can pay in food and shelter." Mary's throat tightened, because he was speaking as if this were a transaction, and transactions were safer than pity. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, because she would not pretend not to understand the shape of the world. James met her eyes without flinching, and in that steadiness, she felt something surprising, not comfort yet, but the absence of deceit. "I won't pretend," he said quietly, "that I don't want companionship as well, and I won't pretend that I've been alone so long I don't sometimes think loneliness is a kind of illness." Mary's jaw tightened. Companionship, she repeated, tasting the word's softness and distrusting it. He nodded once, then added, more plainly, I'm asking you to live with me. To cook, to wash, to manage the little we have, and, yes, to share my bed. The bluntness made heat rise in Mary's face, not from shame but from anger and fear braided together, because she had lived long enough to know that indecent proposals often arrived dressed as practical solutions, and that women were expected to be grateful for being exploited. If I refuse, she asked, keeping her voice low, what then? James's expression did not change. Then nothing happens. You walk away. I don't follow. Mary searched his face, looking for the familiar signs of a man who believed a woman's choices were negotiable. She found fatigue, she found seriousness, and, beneath it, an awkward restraint as though he were ashamed of wanting at all. And if I accept, she said, what are your rules? James inhaled slowly. My rule is that I do not own you. Mary's fingers tightened around her bundle. That is easy to say. It is easier to say than to live, he admitted, and the honesty of that admission unsettled her in a different way, because he was not promising perfection, only intention. Mary stared past him at the dark frames of the machines, at the belts and wheels that turned without care for who stood too close, and she thought of the workhouse, and she thought of the streets, and she thought of the landlady's mouth set in calculation. She did not want this, not in the way a woman wanted love, but she wanted survival, and she wanted dignity within survival, and the world was stingy with both. I will not be owned, she said again, because she needed to hear herself say it. James nodded once, as if relieved she had drawn the line clearly. Nor would I ask it. There was a long pause, and Mary felt the shape of her decision forming, not as romance, not as rescue, but as a door that might remain open if she stepped through it carefully. I accept, she said finally, and her voice did not tremble, because she refused to make the choice sound like defeat. James exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for the duration of her silence. All right, he said, and his tone was quiet, not triumphant, not possessive, only sober with responsibility. They walked through the damp streets together, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend they were strangers, and the city's sounds surrounded them, the distant hammering of metal, the calls of hawkers, the cough of a man somewhere in an alley, the clatter of a cart turning a corner too sharply. Mary did not speak much, because she was listening, and she was thinking, and she was measuring this man beside her, wondering what kind of loneliness had driven him to approach her in the first place, and what kind of restraint had made him do it without threat. James's house was small, as he had promised, wedged into a row where every home pressed against the next, sharing walls, sharing cold, sharing the thin mercy of being indoors. He opened the door and stood aside, allowing her to enter first, and Mary stepped into a narrow downstairs room where a small fire burned and a pot sat on a grate, the air smelling faintly of tea and coal. The place was not tidy in a polished way, but it was not filthy either. It was the home of a man who lived alone and did his best, and Mary recognized that effort with a kind of reluctant empathy. This is it, James said simply. There's not much, but it's ours to manage, if you choose. Mary set her bundle down and looked around, taking in the small table, the 2 chairs, the shelf with a few books and folded papers, and the rough blanket folded neatly near the hearth. She noticed, too, the absence of any feminine trace, and she felt, unexpectedly, less like an intruder and more like a change that might matter. And where do you expect me to sleep? She asked, keeping her voice steady. James gestured toward the narrow stairs. In the attic. There's a mattress and a blanket. It's not comfortable, but it's private. Mary blinked, surprised. And you? Down here, he replied. As I've been. She stared at him, uncertain if she had heard correctly, because men rarely offered privacy without being forced. And your proposal, she said cautiously, feeling the word like grit in her mouth. James's face flushed slightly, not with anger but with embarrassment, and Mary realized, with a strange twist inside her, that he was not accustomed to speaking of such things, that he had spoken because he believed honesty was the only respectable way to make a bargain. "Our intimacy," he said carefully, "begins when you decide it does, and not a moment before." The sentence, with its deliberate shape, settled into the room like a new kind of air. Mary studied him for a long time, searching for mockery, for manipulation, for the hidden hook in the offer, and she found none. She found only a man who wanted what he wanted, but who feared becoming the kind of man he despised. The realization softened something in her chest, though she did not allow herself to call it trust yet, because trust was expensive, and she had learned to spend slowly. That first night, Mary climbed into the attic with a candle in her hand, the flame trembling in the draught, and she lay down beneath the sloping roof while rain tapped at tiles and the city murmured through walls, and she listened to the quiet downstairs where James moved slowly, banking the fire, arranging his tools, settling into a life that had just changed shape. She expected fear to come, expected the familiar tightening that told her she had made a dangerous bargain, but instead what came was a strange, exhausted calm, as if her body had been braced for impact and had found only the steady pressure of an ordinary night. In the darkness, she thought of all the rooms she had slept in over the years, rooms borrowed, rooms earned, rooms endured, and she realized that for the first time in a long time she had a door she could close, a space that was hers, even if only a narrow attic above a man she did not yet know. The thought did not make her happy, not in the bright way stories promised, but it made her breathe more easily, and that, for Mary, was almost the same thing. Morning arrived with pale light and the smell of tea. Mary came down quietly, her hair braided, her dress smoothed, and she found James already awake, sitting at the table with a mug in his hands, reading a folded sheet covered in cramped writing. He looked up when he heard her and stood, as if uncertain whether to offer courtesy or to pretend they were merely co-workers. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. He poured tea into a second mug and placed it on the table without a word, then returned to his papers, as if allowing silence to be a form of respect rather than neglect. They ate simply, bread and a bit of dripping, and Mary noticed the careful way James measured portions, not out of stinginess but out of calculation, because poverty required arithmetic. She noticed, too, that he did not stare at her, did not treat her presence as entertainment, and she realized that he was giving her what few men gave women in her position, which was the dignity of being ignored when she wanted to be ignored. After breakfast, he spoke with that plainness she was beginning to recognize as his habit. "I'll go out," he said. "There's talk of a meeting near the canal later. Men are angry about the dismissals. They should be. But the owner won't listen unless he feels pressure." Mary kept her voice neutral. "You mean a union meeting?" James's mouth tightened faintly. "Yes. You could lose your place," she said, not as warning but as fact. "I might," he agreed, and his eyes flicked to her, as if remembering that his place now affected hers. "But if no one risks anything, nothing changes." Mary nodded slowly, because she had never had the luxury of believing in change, and yet she could not deny the quiet pull of his conviction. When he rose to leave, he hesitated at the door, his hand on the latch, then turned back to her with an expression that was serious in a different way than machine serious, as though he were speaking now not as an overseer, not as a union man, but as the man who had brought her under his roof. "Mary," he said. "Yes. If you want to leave," he continued, choosing each word carefully, "if you decide this was a mistake, you can, and I won't stop you, but I want you to know that while you are here, you are safe from me." The phrase, "safe from me," lodged in her chest like a small ember. Mary met his gaze and nodded once, because she did not trust herself to say more without sounding foolish. "All right," she said quietly. James left, and the door closed behind him with a soft sound that felt, oddly, like the end of a chapter and the beginning of another. Mary stood alone in the small room and looked at the table, at the fire, at the thin blanket folded neatly, and she understood, with a slow clarity, that her life had changed again, not into ease, not into certainty, but into something that might contain, if she was careful, a different kind of loneliness. She began to work without needing to be told what to do, because work was familiar and familiarity calmed her, and as she swept the floor and set water to heat and mended a seam in James's shirt with steady hands, she found herself listening for the sounds of the street outside, not with dread, but with a cautious sense of having a place to return to when the day ended. Mary discovered, in the first weeks, that living in a small house with a man you did not yet know was like living beside a machine whose rhythm you had not learned, because every sound carried meaning and every pause invited interpretation, and yet the strangest part was not the closeness but the restraint, the way James held himself as if he were constantly reminding his own body that she was not an entitlement. He did not linger in the doorway of the attic when she climbed the stairs, and he did not come up at night with excuses, and he did not ask questions that might have sounded harmless but were meant to pry into her privacy. Instead he allowed silence to exist, and Mary, who had always treated silence as a warning, began slowly to understand that silence could also be an offering, a way of saying, without words, that she would not be forced to perform gratitude or comfort him simply because he had provided shelter. Manchester continued outside as it always did, restless and sooty, with the constant shiver of industry vibrating through the bricks, and Mary continued to feel the city's hardness in every small errand, because men noticed a young woman more readily when she walked alone, and hunger made people careless, and careless people became cruel. But now she returned each evening to a door that opened, to a fire that could be coaxed back to life, and to the quiet presence of another person whose loneliness was different from hers and yet strangely familiar. At first, she could not decide whether James's solitude had made him gentler or more dangerous, because men who were lonely sometimes grew tender, and sometimes they grew greedy, and Mary had learned to expect greed more often than tenderness. Yet day after day, he did nothing to prove himself the second kind, and the lack of pressure became a kind of pressure in itself, because it forced her to confront her own assumptions, and she did not like how deeply those assumptions had settled in her. He left early most mornings, sometimes to the mill to speak to men who remained employed, sometimes to meet others in small rooms behind public houses where the air smelled of ale and damp wool and the talk turned quickly toward wages, hours, and the quiet violence of being treated as replaceable. Mary did not ask many questions at first, partly because she did not want to invite his world into her small, precarious safety, and partly because she did not want to care about the politics of men who could afford to be angry, but she listened when he spoke, because listening was how she had survived most of her life, and James spoke in a way that made listening feel worthwhile, not because he tried to impress her, but because his anger had purpose rather than spectacle. When he returned from those meetings, his face sometimes carried a tightness around the mouth, not quite worry and not quite triumph, and he would wash his hands carefully at the basin as if the gesture could rinse off not only grease but the bitterness of being heard and ignored, and Mary would set a plate before him without comment, because she understood the quiet hunger of someone who had spent hours talking about justice and then had to come home to the ordinary truth of an empty purse. She began, little by little, to plan meals the way she planned everything else, in careful increments, saving scraps, stretching broth, using onions and cheap cuts of meat to create the illusion of abundance, and James began to notice, not with condescension but with genuine respect, the way she managed scarcity as if it were a complicated household ledger. "You make it feel like we have more than we do," he said one evening, not as praise meant to charm her, but as a simple observation, and Mary, who was used to having her labor overlooked, felt a small warmth rise somewhere behind her ribs. "It's only planning," she replied, keeping her eyes on the pot, because accepting praise too openly sometimes invited a demand for more. James shook his head slightly. "Planning is a skill, Mary, and skill is never only." The word stayed with her after he had gone quiet again, because she had been told often enough that her worth lay in endurance, in obedience, in the ability to take what was given without complaint, and it was unsettling, almost painful, to hear someone speak as if her competence had value. Their evenings grew into a pattern that did not feel forced, although Mary could not have said when that happened, because change, in her life, had rarely been gentle, and now it was gentle enough that she only noticed it in retrospect. After supper, James often sat at the table with papers spread in front of him, sketches and calculations and pamphlets folded and refolded at the corners, and Mary would mend by the fire or scrub the few dishes they had, moving around the small space without bumping into him, as if their bodies had begun to learn each other's rhythms. Sometimes he read aloud, not dramatically, but quietly, sharing paragraphs about the rights of workers, about the need for organization, about the dangers of remaining silent, and Mary would listen with her hands still, the needle paused, because even when she did not agree with everything he said, she recognized in him the rare kind of man who believed poor lives should matter, and there was comfort in that belief even when it felt naive. One night, when rain struck the window in a steady pattern and the fire was burning low, Mary found herself asking a question she had been holding back because questions made things real. "Why me?" she said, not looking up from her mending, as if casualness could shield her from the answer. James was silent for long enough that she almost wished she had not spoken, and then he replied in a voice that carried careful honesty. "Because you looked like someone who would survive," he said, and then, after a pause, "and because I'm tired of being alone in a room that echoes." Mary's fingers tightened around the cloth. "That isn't an answer." "It is the best I have," he said quietly, and when Mary finally looked at him, she saw in his face not the smugness of a man pleased with his own desire, but the vulnerability of a man who did not quite know how to ask for what he wanted without becoming a villain in his own mind. Mary swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. "Loneliness isn't cured by bargains," she said, because she needed to keep a distance between them, even now. "No," James agreed, and his gaze stayed steady. "But it can be softened by company that isn't bought with fear." Mary looked back down, and she did not answer, because the truth of his words frightened her more than any threat would have, since it suggested she might be safe enough here to feel something, and feeling something was always dangerous. The first time she came down from the attic at night, it was not because James called her, but because the cold was sharper than usual and her blanket seemed suddenly too thin, and she stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment listening to the quiet below, hearing only the faint crackle of embers and James's slow breathing. She could have returned to the attic and endured, as she had endured everything else, but something in her refused, not out of entitlement, but out of a weary sense that she had endured enough for one life, and so she descended carefully, her bare feet cold on the boards, and she stood in the dimness until James stirred and opened his eyes. He sat up immediately, alert, and Mary felt her old instinct to retreat, because men woke quickly when they wanted something, but James did not reach for her, and he did not speak until he had control of his own voice. "Are you unwell?" he asked. "No," Mary said softly, and she surprised herself by continuing, "I'm cold." James nodded as if that explanation required no more than it was. He rose, took a second blanket from a shelf, and held it out, stopping at a distance that made it clear he was offering, not closing in. "Take this," he said. "And if you want to sit by the fire for a while, do." Mary took the blanket, her fingers brushing his, and she felt the warmth of his skin for a brief moment before he stepped back, and that single brush of contact carried a strange intensity, not because it was erotic, but because it was ordinary, and ordinary touch had been absent from her life for so long that it felt like a revelation. She sat by the hearth, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and James returned to his bed without complaint, and for a long time they remained that way, two people awake in the same room, listening to the rain, sharing heat without claiming it. After that night, small things began to change more noticeably, though still slowly, still carefully, as if both of them feared that haste would break something fragile. James began to bring home bread when he could, not as a grand gift but as a practical kindness, and Mary began to set aside his favorite bits without thinking, and then to scold herself inwardly when she realized she had done it, because affection had a way of revealing itself in habits rather than declarations. Sometimes, when he came in soaked from rain, she would hand him a cloth for his hair, and sometimes his fingers would graze her wrist as he took it, and the contact would linger half a heartbeat longer than necessary, and Mary would feel her body react, not with panic, but with a subtle awareness she could not entirely name. In the evenings, their conversations lengthened, not always about politics or work, but about the quieter things that made a person who they were, and Mary found herself speaking, cautiously at first, of the years after her parents' deaths, of the way she had moved between households like a piece of furniture that could be shifted when inconvenient, of the workhouse she had avoided by luck and stubbornness, of the small humiliations that piled up until they became a kind of constant weather. James listened without interrupting, and when Mary stopped, uncertain if she had said too much, he did not offer pity, which she would have rejected, he offered understanding. "I know what it is," he said one night, his voice low, "to feel like your life is decided by people who never ask your name." Mary's eyes stung unexpectedly, and she stared at the fire until the sensation passed. "You're a man," she replied, not accusingly, but as fact. "Men don't get decided the same way." James's mouth tightened. "Not the same way," he admitted, "but I've been decided, Mary, more than once, and I'm tired of it, and that's why I talk about unions and rights and all of it, because I don't want the world to keep deciding who gets to eat and who gets to freeze." Mary studied him for a long moment, and she realized that his revolutionary streak was not vanity, not a man playing at being dangerous, but an anger born of empathy, and empathy, she thought, was rarer than money. It was around this time that Mary began looking for work that could be done without returning to a factory, because the thought of stepping back into that thunder of machinery and being dismissed again at someone's whim made her stomach tighten, and she also understood, with a pride she tried to keep quiet, that she did not want to be entirely dependent on James's wages, because dependency had a way of becoming a trap even when the person holding the key meant well. She asked discreet questions in the neighborhood, and after several days of quiet inquiry she found a woman who took in piecework for a small shop that sold hats and ribbons to those who could afford prettiness, and Mary, who had learned in her younger years to mend fine fabric for wealthier households, offered her hands. The work arrived in bundles wrapped in paper, small hat bases, ribbons, artificial flowers, feathers that had to be handled gently so they did not break, and Mary sat by the window in what light she could find, her fingers moving with careful precision as she stitched and arranged, creating delicate things that felt almost absurd in a city that smelled of coal. The first time she completed a hat and saw how neatly the trims sat, how balanced the decoration looked, she felt a small, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with craft, and she realized she had missed that feeling more than she had known. When James came home and saw the work laid out, he stopped in the doorway as if he had walked into a room that belonged to another life. "You did that?" he asked. Mary nodded, suddenly shy, because being good at something invited attention, and attention invited expectation. "It's beautiful," James said, and the sincerity in his voice made her cheeks warm. "And it will help us." "It will help," she agreed, and then, after a pause, she added quietly, "It helps me too." James looked at her, his expression softening. "Because it's yours," he said, as if he understood without being told. Mary did not answer, because she could not trust her voice to remain steady, and James, sensing this, turned to wash his hands without pressing further, allowing her the dignity of not having her pride handled like a fragile ornament. As weeks became months, the line between their arrangement and something else continued to blur, not because either of them spoke about it, but because intimacy grows in the spaces where people stop guarding themselves every moment. Mary began to sit closer at the table without noticing she had done it, and James began to lean toward her when he spoke, not aggressively, but as if proximity made truth easier. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside quieted enough that you could hear distant footsteps in the street, Mary would come down from the attic and sit by the fire with her sewing, and James would remain awake a little longer than he needed to, turning pages without reading, simply because her presence made the room feel less hollow. It was one such night, when the firelight moved slowly across the walls and Mary's needle flashed faintly as it pierced cloth, that James spoke with a seriousness that made her look up. "I meant what I said," he told her, and his voice was low, as if he feared the words might disturb something. "I won't touch you unless you ask it." Mary's breath caught, not because she had forgotten, but because hearing it again made it real in a new way, as if the choice were now sitting on the table between them, waiting patiently. "And if I never ask?" she said, her tone steady, testing him. James held her gaze. "Then I will still be grateful you're here." Mary felt something shift, slow and deep, like a door unlatched from the inside, because gratitude was not desire, and yet it was tender in a way desire often was not, and she realized, with a quiet, unsettling clarity, that she did not only fear being taken, she also feared being wanted, because wanting could make you soft, and softness could make you break. She returned to her stitching, and James returned to his papers, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, but the silence had changed, becoming charged with the knowledge that choice was present, and that choice, for Mary, was both a gift and a weight. When the first winter under James's roof arrived fully, with frost whitening the window edges and coal becoming precious enough to ration, Mary fell ill for a few days, not seriously, but enough that weakness forced her to accept care, and accepting care was harder than any labor. James made tea, warmed cloths, coaxed her to drink broth, and sat at the foot of the attic stairs listening for her breathing, too uneasy to sleep properly, and Mary, half-fevered, half-aware, realized that his concern did not feel like ownership, but like attachment, and the thought frightened and comforted her at once. When she recovered and came down again, she found James by the hearth with an expression that tried to be casual and failed. "You're better," he said, and his voice sounded rough. "I am," Mary replied, and then, because the truth felt too large to keep inside, she added quietly, "Thank you." James nodded as if the thanks mattered more than she could know, then turned away to hide whatever moved across his face, and Mary watched him, feeling something in her chest soften further, not into certainty, but into a kind of trust that had begun, against her will, to take root. The slow burn of their affection was not a series of dramatic steps, but a gradual surrender of small defenses, and as the months continued to fold into one another, Mary found herself thinking of James not only as the man whose roof sheltered her, but as the man whose presence had become strangely necessary, and that necessity brought with it a quiet ache, because she knew that when you needed someone, you also gave them the power to hurt you, even accidentally. She had spent most of her life avoiding that risk, keeping her heart tucked away behind practicality, and now practicality itself was leading her toward a place where the heart could no longer remain untouched. One evening, as Mary finished a hat trimmed with pale ribbon and small silk flowers, she looked up to find James watching her hands with an expression that was almost reverent, as though he were seeing not only the work but the woman who had produced it. "What?" she asked, a touch defensive, because being seen could feel like exposure. James shook his head slowly. "Nothing," he said, then corrected himself with the same honesty that always returned him to the truth. "Not nothing. I was thinking how strange it is that a world that calls you replaceable has no idea what it throws away." Mary swallowed, her fingers still on the ribbon. "Don't talk like that," she murmured, as if the words could make her hope. James's voice softened. "I'll try," he said, and after a pause, he added, "But it's true." Mary looked down again, and she stitched the final seam with care, because it was easier to control thread than to control the feeling rising inside her, a feeling that was not yet love, but was already more than gratitude, and it moved through her like warmth slowly spreading from a fire, patient and relentless. Outside, Manchester kept turning, indifferent and grey, but inside the small back-to-back house, something steady and intimate was being built, quietly, through shared scarcity, shared evenings, and the growing knowledge that loneliness, when met with gentleness, could begin to loosen its grip. And still, despite the softening, Mary did not climb into James's bed, because she wanted her first step toward him to be chosen from desire rather than desperation, and James, perhaps understanding this without needing it explained, continued to wait, allowing time to do what force never could, which was to make a woman believe that her yes would be heard as sacred rather than as surrender. As the winter eased into a reluctant spring, the house seemed to breathe differently, not because it grew larger or warmer, but because Mary began to occupy it with a steadiness that made even narrow rooms feel less like borrowed space and more like a shared life, and James, in turn, began to carry himself with the quiet awareness of a man who had stopped thinking of his home as a private refuge and started thinking of it as something that must be tended for two. The change did not announce itself in declarations, because neither of them was inclined toward theatrical feeling, but it revealed itself in the smallest practical habits, the way James left the kettle filled before going out because he knew she would want tea without having to fetch water with cold hands, and the way Mary began to keep his work shirts mended before he asked because she had learned the exact place his sleeve always tore when he leaned too close to certain gears. The hat work continued, and it grew steadily, not in wealth but in rhythm, and Mary's fingers, which had once been valued only for the speed with which they could feed cloth into machines, found a different kind of use now, one that required patience and an eye for balance and the courage to make something purely decorative in a world where decoration felt almost obscene. She worked at the window whenever the light was generous enough, and when the sky was dark or the smoke too thick, she brought her stitching closer to the fire, leaning forward to catch the glow, her shoulders bending in concentration, her mouth tightening slightly as she aligned ribbon and thread so precisely that the seam would vanish to anyone who looked too quickly. James watched her sometimes without meaning to, and Mary noticed his watching without looking up, because there was a particular kind of being observed that felt dangerous, and another kind that felt unexpectedly safe, and James's attention belonged to the second kind. It did not strip her, it did not measure her for use, it simply rested on her as if she were something real in a world that often treated people like shadows. On some nights, when he returned from meetings tired and tense, he would sit at the table and rub his thumb along the edge of a pamphlet as if the small repetitive motion might calm his mind, and Mary would continue to sew, and the room would fill with a silence that was not empty but companionable, a shared stillness in which both of them could lay down their guarded selves for a while. It was in one of those silences that Mary began, slowly and almost against her own will, to feel hunger that had nothing to do with food. It came first as a heightened awareness, the way the air in the room seemed to change whenever James moved behind her, the way she could sense him approaching even when she did not hear his steps, the way her skin seemed to recognize the warmth of his body at a distance as if proximity itself carried meaning. She would catch herself listening for the sound of his breathing when he sat near the hearth, and sometimes she would find her eyes drifting to his hands, those hands that could coax broken metal back into function and yet could also pour tea with gentleness, and she would feel a small, sharp pull inside her, an urge to reach out, to close the space, to test whether closeness could be chosen without becoming a trap. Then fear would rise beside the longing, quiet but insistent, reminding her that desire had been used against women like her, that need was often mistaken for permission, and that permission once given was rarely respected. So Mary held herself still, and she waited, not because she wanted to torture herself with restraint, but because she wanted, for once in her life, to be sure that when she crossed a line it would be from her own will rather than from survival's coercion, and James, who had promised patience with the sober seriousness of a man making a vow, continued to keep that promise even when his own loneliness pressed against him like hunger. The first time Mary saw proof of what his restraint cost him was on a Sunday evening when the city seemed marginally quieter, as if even the factories observed a kind of reluctant pause. James had returned from a meeting later than usual, his coat damp, his hair darkened by rain, his mouth set in a line that suggested he had been arguing not only with others but with himself. He washed his hands at the basin, slowly, scrubbing at grease that was not there, and when he finally turned, he seemed startled to find Mary still awake, seated by the fire with her needle resting idly in her lap as if she had been waiting without admitting it. She did not speak. She watched. He removed his coat slowly, folding it with care that felt almost ceremonial, as if the simple act of putting it away required more attention than usual. His jaw was set, not in anger, but in the quiet tension of a man who had spent the day holding himself together through effort alone. When he finally turned toward the room, his eyes passed over her without quite seeing her, lingering instead on the fire, on the table, on the familiar outlines of a life that usually steadied him. Something in Mary tightened. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself too many times to mistake it for anything else. It was the expression of someone who had carried more than he could comfortably bear and had no language left for complaint. "You're hurting," she said gently. The words were not an accusation. They were an acknowledgement. James stopped. He seemed surprised by them, as though he had not realized the state of his own body until she named it. He inhaled slowly, then let the breath go, and when he finally looked at her, his eyes were darker than usual, clouded with exhaustion and something more private, something that did not belong to the mill or the meetings or the long arguments with men who wanted change but feared its cost. "I didn't want to bring it home," he said quietly. Mary rose from her chair without haste. She crossed the room with the same deliberate calm that had guided her through so many careful choices, stopping a few steps away from him, close enough to feel the chill of the air clinging to his clothes. "You live here," she replied. "So does what weighs on you." James gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. "That's exactly it." She reached out then, not to touch him, but to take his coat from his hands, relieving him of its weight as naturally as if she had done it 100 times before. When her fingers brushed his wrist, she felt the tension there, tight and unyielding, and she knew that what he carried was not merely fatigue, but restraint stretched thin. "They argue," he said after a moment, his voice low and even. "They want change, but only the kind that doesn't cost them anything. And I stand there listening, knowing that some things can't be softened." Mary nodded. She did not ask for details. She understood enough. "You always choose carefully," she said. "Even when it costs you." James's gaze lingered on her face, searching. "And you notice?" "Yes," she answered softly. "I do." The silence that followed was different from any they had shared before. It was not companionable in the familiar sense, nor was it strained. It felt charged, as though something long held back had finally been given permission to exist between them. James's voice, when he spoke again, carried a vulnerability she had not heard before. "There are days when not reaching for you feels harder than anything I argue for." Mary felt the words settle inside her, warm and heavy, and with them came a sudden, clear understanding that his restraint was not indifference, nor hesitation, but devotion shaped by respect. She stepped closer. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Simply closing a distance that no longer served them. "I don't need to be spared," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "I need to be chosen." James's breath caught. "Mary." Mary took another step, closing the distance until she could feel the warmth of him without contact. "I want to," she whispered, and she did not add anything else, because anything else would have been explanation, and she did not want explanation to be the first thing she offered him. James lifted his hand slowly, as if approaching a flame that might burn or warm depending on how carefully it was handled, and he touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. The contact was so gentle that Mary's eyes stung unexpectedly, not with tears of sadness but with the shock of being handled as if her boundaries mattered. She leaned into his hand before she could stop herself, and when he kissed her, it was with the same gentleness, unhurried and questioning, a kiss that waited for her response rather than taking it for granted. Mary answered with a soft exhale, her hands rising to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath fabric, feeling the solidity of him, and the kiss deepened gradually as if they were learning each other's pace, learning how to be close without losing the respect that had made closeness possible in the first place. James's arms came around her with restraint even in the embrace, holding her firmly enough to steady her but not so tightly that she could not move away, and Mary, who had always feared the moment a man's grip became certainty, felt instead the strange relief of being held as a choice rather than as a claim. When they parted, they remained close, foreheads almost touching, their breathing mingling. James's voice was rough with control. "Tell me to stop if you want it." Mary's fingers curled slightly in his shirt. "I won't," she said, and the quiet certainty of her own answer made her tremble. They moved to his bed later, not with the frantic hunger of people trying to seize pleasure before it vanished, but with the careful deliberation of two solitary lives learning to trust intimacy. Mary undressed without turning away, because she refused to treat her own body as shame, and James watched her as if watching were not entitlement but reverence, his gaze steady, his hands waiting until she reached for him first. When they finally lay together, it was slow, attentive, full of pauses that were not hesitation but listening, and Mary found herself discovering that desire could be tender, could be safe, could be something that did not erase her but returned her to herself. Afterward, Mary lay with her head on James's shoulder, the room dim except for embers, and she listened to the sounds of the house settling, to the distant murmur of the city, to the steady rhythm of James's breathing. She felt, for a moment, the old fear that happiness always carried, the fear that anything gentle must be temporary, and she whispered into the darkness, "What if this changes?" James's hand moved slowly along her arm, soothing rather than claiming. "It will," he said quietly, and Mary's chest tightened until he continued, "because everything changes, but it doesn't mean it ends." Mary closed her eyes, letting the words sink in, letting herself believe, however cautiously, that change could include growth rather than loss. From that night onward, the attic stopped being her only refuge, though she still used it for work, for quiet, for the privacy she sometimes needed to gather herself. She slept downstairs more often, and their nights became part of their life rather than an exception to it. James did not become possessive, and Mary did not become dependent in the way she had feared, but their connection deepened through a steady accumulation of shared moments. The way he warmed her hands between his when she came in from cold rain, the way she waited up for him after late meetings and did not pretend she had been asleep, the way he sometimes read aloud not from pamphlets but from a battered novel he had found years ago and kept because it had once made him feel less alone. Mary's hat work improved as well, as though comfort allowed her skill to bloom, and soon the bundles arrived more frequently, with finer materials, and with notes that praised her neatness and her sense of arrangement. The woman who delivered the work, a brisk messenger from the shop, began to look at Mary with a different kind of interest, not the pity of someone who saw poverty, but the appraisal of someone who recognized talent. "You have a hand for this," the messenger said one afternoon, watching Mary attach a delicate spray of silk blossoms so naturally that it seemed the hat had grown them. Mary kept her voice modest, because pride invited loss. "I do what I can." The messenger sniffed, half approval, half impatience with false humility. "The mistress will want to see your work in person." Mary's stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because she sells to ladies with money," the woman replied, as if that explained everything. "And ladies with money expect perfection." Mary nodded slowly, and when he left, she sat for a long time staring at her thread, feeling the old tremor of uncertainty return, because being noticed could be dangerous, and being noticed could also be the only way out of endless scarcity. That evening, James came home and found Mary unusually quiet, her hands still, her gaze fixed on nothing. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his coat. Mary hesitated, then told him about the messenger's words, about the possibility that the shop owner might want to see her work. James listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until she finished. "That could be good," he said carefully. Mary's throat tightened. "Or it could be nothing." James nodded. "It might be nothing. But it might be something. And if it is something, you should take it." The immediate support unsettled her. "You say that too quickly," she replied, not accusingly, but with the quiet suspicion of someone who had learned that men's support often came with conditions. James's gaze held hers. "I say it because it's true," he answered. "And because if you can earn money with your hands in a way that doesn't break your body, you deserve that." Mary looked down. "Deserve," she murmured, as if the word were unfamiliar. James stepped closer, not crowding her, just closing enough that his presence could steady her. "Yes," he said. "Deserve." The following week, Mary was summoned to the shop, a small place in a better part of the city where the soot seemed lighter and the windows were cleaner. She went with her best shawl and her hair pinned neatly, carrying one of her finished hats wrapped carefully in paper. The shop smelled of fabric and perfume and the faint sweetness of wax, and the women inside moved with an anxious precision, because serving wealth demanded a particular kind of choreography. The mistress, a woman with sharp eyes and perfectly arranged hair, examined Mary's work in silence, turning it slowly, running a finger along seams, lifting the brim to inspect the underside. Mary stood still, her hands folded, feeling as though she were the thing being assessed. Finally, the woman looked up. "You did this?" "Yes," Mary replied, keeping her voice steady. The mistress's lips tightened, almost into a smile. "You have taste," she said, as if taste were a rare crime among the poor. "And you have patience. I will give you more work." Mary exhaled slowly, relief and caution mingling. "And you will be paid fairly," the woman added, as if the promise itself were generosity. Mary nodded. "Thank you." When she returned home, James was waiting, and Mary realized she had begun to measure her days by the moment she could tell him what had happened. She described the shop, the mistress's inspection, the promise of more work, and James listened with a quiet pride that did not diminish her achievement by claiming it as his own. "That's you," he said simply. "You did that." Mary looked at him, and in that moment, she understood that love, when it was real, did not fear a woman's growth, it made room for it. In the months that followed, the house remained small, the city remained harsh, and money remained scarce enough to require constant careful planning, but there was a difference now, because Mary contributed not only labor but income, and with income came a fragile sense of control. They bought coal without quite as much dread. They bought bread that was not stale. They bought a small piece of meat once a week without feeling it was reckless. These changes did not transform their world into comfort, but they softened the sharpest edges of survival, and in that softness, affection had room to deepen into something steadier. James continued his union work, and there were days when he came home exhilarated, speaking of small victories, of men agreeing to stand together, of plans that might one day change conditions, and there were days when he came home quiet, defeated by the slow stubbornness of power. On those nights, Mary did not offer empty reassurance, she offered her presence, and sometimes she offered her body, not as consolation, but as connection, and James received her as though receiving were a privilege rather than a right. One night, when they lay together listening to the rain, Mary traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip and asked, in a voice so soft it almost vanished, "Do you ever regret choosing this life?" James turned his head slightly to kiss her palm. "I regret the injustice," he said. "I don't regret you." Mary closed her eyes, letting the answer settle into her, and she felt, with a quiet and surprising certainty, that her long loneliness had begun, at last, to loosen its hold, not because life had become easy, but because it had become shared. And yet, even as love deepened, the world remained capable of changing everything with one unexpected offer, one door opened by someone wealthy enough to treat opportunity as a casual gesture, and that door, though still unseen, was already moving quietly toward them, carried in silk ribbon and fine stitching, approaching with the soft, dangerous sound of possibility. The invitation arrived on a pale morning in early autumn, folded carefully into a thick envelope that looked almost out of place against the worn wood of the table, and Mary sensed its weight before she opened it, because certain moments carried a gravity that announced itself quietly, without drama, as if the world were holding its breath. The letter bore the seal of the shop's mistress, pressed neatly into wax, and Mary broke it with careful fingers, aware that James was watching her not with suspicion but with a kind of attentive stillness that suggested he already understood this was not merely another bundle of work. The words inside were precise and courteous, written in a hand that assumed obedience without demanding it outright, and they spoke of talent recognized, of an opportunity beyond piecework, of a boutique in London where Mary's skills would be put to proper use, where her days would be spent among fine materials and discerning clients rather than coal dust and narrow rooms. The offer was generous by any standard Mary had ever known, promising wages she had never imagined earning and conditions that bordered on luxury, and when he finished reading it out loud for her, she remained seated, the letter resting loosely over the table, her eyes unfocused, as if the room around her had shifted slightly out of alignment. James did not speak immediately. He watched her face instead, reading the changes there with a care that had grown habitual, noticing the tightening at the corners of her mouth, the faint crease between her brows that appeared when she was thinking too hard, when she was weighing something that mattered. "It's London," she said at last, her voice low and even, though her pulse had quickened in a way she could not entirely control. James nodded slowly. "That's far." "Yes," Mary replied. "And different." He waited, because he had learned that waiting was sometimes the most respectful form of listening. "They want me to work in the shop," she continued, as if speaking the words aloud might make them less unreal. "Not from home. Not by the piece. In the shop itself." James leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, and for a moment Mary feared she would see disappointment or fear cross his face, that old instinctive dread that a woman's opportunity must come at a man's expense, but what she saw instead was something quieter and more complex, a careful restraint that allowed space for her decision before his own feelings could speak. "That's a rare thing," he said finally. "For someone like us." Mary swallowed. "Yes." Silence settled between them, not heavy but full, and Mary felt the truth pressing against her from all sides, because she understood what this offer represented in the language of survival. Independence, security, the chance to step out of constant scarcity and into a life where skill might finally be rewarded without apology. She thought of the streets she had walked as a girl, of the rooms she had borrowed and lost, of the workhouse she had narrowly avoided, and she knew that if she had received such an offer once, she would have taken it without hesitation, without even looking back. And yet she did look back now, because James was there, because this narrow house had become something more than shelter, because love had grown in the spaces where she had least expected it, slow and patient and deeply rooted, and she realized, with a mixture of clarity and sorrow, that leaving would not simply be a change of address, it would be a severing. "What do you think?" she asked quietly, and the question was not a test but an invitation, because she trusted him enough now to hear his truth. James did not answer at once. He rose and went to the window, standing with his hands clasped behind him as he looked out at the street, at the familiar movement of the city that had shaped them both. When he spoke, his voice was steady, though it carried a depth that made Mary's chest tighten. "I think," he said slowly, "that if you go, you will do well, because you always do, and I think that you deserve a life where your hands are valued and your days are not measured only by endurance." Mary's throat tightened. "And us?" James turned to face her, and there was no evasion in his gaze. "I think I would miss you every day," he said simply. The honesty of it undid her more than any attempt to persuade her would have. She rose and crossed the room, stopping a step away from him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, to smell the faint traces of oil and soap that had become so familiar. "I don't want to leave you," she said, and the admission felt like both relief and fear, because once spoken it could not be taken back. James reached for her hands, holding them gently, not gripping, not pulling. "Then don't," he said, and then, because he was who he was, he added, "but don't stay because you think you owe me your future." Mary shook her head slowly. "I don't owe you," she said. "I choose you." The words settled between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not triumphant, but deeply felt, and James closed his eyes for a brief moment as if bracing himself against the weight of what she had just given him. When he opened them again, his expression was softer than she had ever seen it, stripped of caution, stripped of restraint, filled instead with a devotion that made Mary's breath catch. "I won't waste that choice," he said, his voice low and earnest. They composed the letter together that afternoon, his hand steady as she thanked the mistress for the offer and declined it politely, explaining that her circumstances would not allow her to relocate, and when she sealed the envelope she felt a surprising calm, not regret, not bitterness, but a quiet certainty that some opportunities were measured not by what they offered, but by what they asked you to give up in return. Life continued, as life always does, in its steady, unremarkable way, and if anything changed, it changed so gradually that Mary could not have said when it began. The hat work remained steady, even increased, as the shop continued to value her skill despite her refusal, and James's position at the mill grew more secure as his expertise became harder to replace and his measured leadership earned him a respect that neither threats nor pamphlets could have forced. There were setbacks, of course, moments when money tightened again, when illness brushed too close, when the city reminded them of its indifference, but they faced these moments together now, not as isolated individuals but as a partnership shaped by shared choices. It was during a quiet winter evening, with the fire burning low and the city muffled by snow, that Mary realized she was with child. She told James without ceremony, her voice calm, because fear had learned not to rule her, and James listened in silence before drawing her into his arms with a tenderness that spoke of or rather than alarm. They did not rush the future after that. The months of her pregnancy unfolded at a deliberately slower pace, marked by careful adjustments to work and routine, by James's quiet vigilance and Mary's growing attentiveness to the life forming within her. She continued to sew, though for fewer hours, and James took on more responsibility at the mill, returning home each evening with the same steadiness that had first made her trust him, and as spring turned to summer and then back toward autumn, the house filled with a new anticipation that softened even the hardest days. The birth came on a long, quiet night, with rain tapping softly against the windows and the city unusually hushed, and when their child finally cried, small and insistent, Mary felt a completeness she had never imagined possible, not because life had become perfect, but because it had become deeply, irrevocably shared. James wept openly, unashamed, holding both mother and child with a reverence that made Mary understand, in that moment, that love was not only something that comforted, it was something that endured. Years passed, measured now not by scarcity alone but by growth, by small improvements that accumulated into real change. James was promoted, his skill and reliability finally acknowledged in ways that brought better wages and less constant strain, and after the birth of their second child they moved into a larger house, still modest but filled with light, where the children could sleep without hearing the factory walls breathe. Mary's work continued, though she chose it now as much for pleasure as for necessity, and her hands, once valued only for their endurance, became known for their beauty. When they grew older, and the city changed around them in ways they could not have imagined in their youth, Mary sometimes thought of the letter from London, of the life she might have lived among silken mirrors, and she felt no regret, because she had learned that fulfillment was not found in what you left behind, but in what you built slowly, deliberately, with someone who saw you not as a means of survival but as a companion in it. In their later years, when James's hair had turned grey and Mary's hands bore the fine map of a life well used, they would sit together in the evenings, watching the light fade, their children grown and gone, and Mary would rest her head against James's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, the same rhythm that had once anchored her in a narrow house in Manchester. She would think, then, not of hardship, not of lost opportunities, but of the quiet miracle of having chosen, freely and without fear, a love that had never asked her to disappear in order to belong. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.